All right, well, thank you everyone for attending today, and apologies for the delay. We've operating a new system that we were unsure of, so unfortunately it took us a bit longer to get set up. So I think looking around at the people that have attended, it's clear to see that everybody in this room is genuinely and deeply concerned with the lives of everyday Australians. And bearing that in mind, when we recognise that, we'll be a force to be recognised with. My name is Helen and my job today is to introduce our speakers and to tell you about the format of the day. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to the elders past, present, and those elders that are emerging. This land has never been ceded, and we recognise their continued struggle for recognition and dignity and sovereignty as a First Nations people. So the format for today's meeting will be as follows. We will hear from our guest speakers, and they'll have approximately 15 minutes each, and at the end of the speakers there'll be question time or comments from either our Zoom people that are on Zoom or from people from the floor. We were going to break into groups to discuss the content of the speeches and arrive at ideas for practical measures and steps that we can all participate in to, and I steal this phrase from our international friends, to take us from out of the movement and into the masses. So each group will have a facilitator and we'll reconvene and we'll pull those ideas together to formulate a united plan. So to explain a little bit about the Australians for a New Democracy and to clarify a little bit about the group, I'll just spend a couple of minutes doing that. So the Australians for a New Democracy began back in 2020, and we started as an organisation with our main banner coming under the words of life, sovereignty and peace. And it was in an effort to unite people and groups around an international movement opposed to the economic and political domination of the United States. And we had the intention that, primarily we were wanting to change the Australian political climate, landscape, and that was going to be our contribution to weakening US domination. Over the last 2 years, our emphasis hasn't changed, but certainly the way that we've approached the subject has changed a wee bit, and we realise that we really need to narrow the target a wee bit more and place more emphasis on focusing on how to increase everyday Australians' participation in the political life and seeking real change. And so much more of an emphasis on that level. So we're broadening the base of the people that are involved in the movement. So what we seek today is to unite people and groups in the idea that even though we may have differences, there is more in common than not. And we'd like to seek unity around a couple of points. One would be an economy that meets the needs of the people, and two, a democratic system that meets the needs of the people also. They're not new ideas by any means, and around the world we see organisations developing that have many tendencies within them, but they are united around the common goals, and that is that they want to change their society. And that's where we would like to end up. Out of this movement in other countries, something new will develop, and something better will come out of these movements. And that's of course something that's an ongoing process, and we'd like everybody here to participate in those changes. So moving on to talking about our speakers, our first speaker today is Joe Montero. Joe's been involved in the political scene for about 40 years or more, and has been involved in worker struggle and political movements for change. Our second speaker is Tony Mav, and he is the secretary of the AMWU. His union is at the forefront of a campaign to bring manufacturing back to Australia. And of course this will create more jobs and improve the lives of working Australians as they're able to organise for better wages and conditions. At the forefront of the election 2020 was the issue of cost of living, and the unions are at the forefront of ensuring that those demands are met. So I'm sure Tony will present information in this sphere. Our last speaker is Ian Watson. Ian is an economist who is very well versed on wages and conditions in Australia. He's done a stack of research on wages in the economy and can be called, and Ian can correct me if I'm wrong on this. He's a leading figure in this field. So without any further comments from myself, I hand you over to Joe Monteiro.
Okay, good afternoon everyone. Just before I start, just a couple of quick comments. One is that there have been a lot of apologies and a lot of people for various reasons can't turn up today. But there has been considerable interest in what's happening, and we are recording what's going on, and it will be circulated after this meeting. I want to, before I go on with my contribution, also to drop a couple of names, particularly some of the groups that I have been associated with in recent years. I'd like to mention Fair Go for Pensioners. We've got a couple of people here. I'd also like to mention people involved in the campaign to free Julian Assange. Got a few from there involved here today. I want to make a special mention of Earthworker. I'm a member of Earthworker as well, and I have got a message from, you could say, the person who put the effort in to make that a reality, Dave Kerry. There's another one, he can't, his health reasons precludes him from being here today, but he wants to convey his greeting and give his support and give the support of Earthworker. I'll just mention, for those who don't know, Earthworker has been doing some pioneering work in setting up cooperatives, particularly worker cooperatives. There are a few of those now in operation. It's small scale at the moment in terms of the Australian economy, but its value, its greatest value is that these cooperatives are a test case. One is producing hot water systems in the Latrobe Valley. There's one involving a group of cleaners. So the second thing is that the people who are involved are finding ways, new ways to create jobs and to create incomes. So it's a fantastic initiative, and they see what we're doing here is related to what they're on about. But I want to move on now, and the first thing I want to say is that we need to have an idea of the political context we're in right now today. We all know a few weeks ago there was a federal election, and there was, I think some people expected the kind of result that happened, others didn't. But we must understand not only the numbers that came up on election night and the counting, we must understand what lies behind them. And the election confirmed that most Australians regard the political system, those who work within it, as, to some level, mostly corrupt and working for the big end of town. Most people living in Australia know that their situation is getting worse. They feel they're not being listened to, and they feel they don't have a voice. They feel betrayed and want much better than what's on offer. This includes, I feel, quite a few of the people who voted for the major political parties. They're feeling some of this discontent, which is verging onto anger. As a result, the Liberal Party copped the hammering. But let's not delude ourselves, so did Labor, which received the lowest vote since 1910, merely 32% of the electorate. A quirk of the Australian electoral system meant that despite losing support, Labor was able to form government. Wouldn't happen anywhere else. This is now a government with the support of a minority of the population only. This brings the political necessity to find ways to unite, ways that represent the third of those who voted for Labor, the third who voted for the Greens and Independents, and win over most of the other third who voted for the coalition parties and a few other smaller outfits. This can only be brought about through the emergence of a shared vision and action. This must be built. It's not an easy task, but the conditions in Australia are favourable. Opportunities have opened up, and it would be silly not to take advantage of them, not to seize the hour of the day. The downside is that when it comes to our movements, there is not enough unity, far from it. No clear vision. Too many are distracted by irrelevancies tied to political dogmatism and sectarianism. There is a tendency to exist in isolated silos, believing that what is going on in our silo is the most important thing in the world, and what is going outside is less important. These problems get in the way of moving forward and must be overcome. The antidote is to reject the evangelical political style and adopt a politics based on an iron connection with working people. One that listens and talks with, not talks at. We must reject the politics that confines itself to a sideshow at the edge of the political stage, to adopt one that moves towards the centre of the political stage. Our movement is our movement, or our collection of movements representing the interests of the majority. If it is, we should act like it is. Everything depends on building the broadest possible base possible, achieving collective agreement on what is most important right now, and linking this solidly to practical measures that will transform ideas into action that leads towards the realisation of our shared vision. This is where Australians for a New Democracy comes in. We are not setting up a political party. We want to talk with them all. The intention is to raise the need for and assist in building the unity and action just mentioned. We don't want to impose. We want to encourage discussion, collaboration and ownership in building the path to our shared goal. Recognising that there are diverse opinions about all sorts of issues, we advocate tolerance and focusing on unity around what is most important. To succeed, one must work strategically and tactically. To move forward one step at a time, focus on what is immediately most important and use this to take the next step forward. Does this mean attacking the Labor Party? No. Attacks on political parties and organisations should be avoided. The most important thing is, what are the issues? We need to focus on them and not focus on identity and labels. It is vitally important to connect with the base of all parties and movements seeking to win over the majority, to isolate the few who will never be with us and will do everything they can to stop us. So they are our adversaries, not those who slightly disagree with us. Even some major disagreements we can overlook as long as we can unite on what's most important. We are faced by a powerful enemy in the form of those who presently dominate all forms of power, whether it be the political system, the bureaucracy, the legal institutions, police and of course the Australian economy. They are in the hands of an elite minority, and there is a need to build the means to transfer this power downwards. There is no escaping this necessity. We have entered into a time of evolving economic, social and environmental crisis, and it is highly likely that all are going to get much worse in the foreseeable future. The COVID experience has given us a taste of what is to come. In fact, the political division witnessed at the election rises out of this emerging multi-pronged crisis, and it is between the elites and the rest of the Australian population. Today we see the early shoots of a movement of the Australian people wanting change. There may be, at this time, a lack of clarity about what that means, but this can develop over time. Our collective role is to assist in this development. At the centre of everything is the question of democracy. People know that they are losing their rights. And it is the understanding, and it is this understanding that they are being treated unfairly that motivates them. These are the connections with the concept of democracy. This is why we have taken the title of Australians for a New Democracy. A democracy that is not merely defined in the narrow sense of the right to vote. The right to vote is important, but Australia needs a democracy that gives all a voice in the workplace, in the broader economy, and in formulating and carrying out social objectives. Democracy of this type will not come about by mere proclamations and slogans. It can only be built through clarity and practical initiatives propelling Australia in this direction. Today is intended as just a very small part in this process. Here are some broad areas that need attention, and I suggest become part of the discussion today. The industrial relations system. The one we have is heavily weighted in favour of the employers. What should this be replaced with? How do we move to an economy that is for people? What measures can be put forward? How can we deal with the rising cost of living, create real jobs and ensure that the wealth is shared fairly? What is the answer to the climate crisis? Can we rely on market mechanisms or an investor-led transition? Do we have to rely on something else? How do we start building new institutions of representative and collective democracy inside and outside the workplace? Today, we will discuss these and other issues that might be presented. It is hoped that everyone here will carry the message and become involved in putting the ideas forward. Continue consultation with others to win broader agreement and begin the initiatives that will create the path to our emergent vision and convert it into a reality. Thank you.
Right, so thank you, Joe. Our next speaker is Tony Mapp from the AMW, and if you want to.
Yeah. Hope this technology works fine. Thanks, Helen. I'll just introduce myself and who my union is. I'm Tony Mavramatis. Most people call me Tony Mav for obvious reasons. Been a State Secretary of the Victorian branch in the AMW for the last 4 years, and it's been challenging. Asking to get up here and make a speech about what our branch is doing in 15 minutes is absolutely impossible because there's so much going on, but we'll touch on some certain issues within that 15-minute time frame, Helen. and do my best to give the vision of our vision about where we're heading over the next years or so. Listening to Joe, we share the same values. Agree with the sentiments that you say and the comments that you say. Only one disagreement, and that disagreement is, do we attack political parties? And I think we should always lobby and campaign against political parties. That's what the movement does, and we will aim to do that when political parties do not agree with our vision and our values. All the rest, totally agree. I just thought I'd mention that because I think it's important that we don't lose our vision on that. Because at the end of the day, it's not politicians that make this country, it's movements that make this country to improve the country. It's not going to be the politicians. The politicians need us to tell them what they need to do. They need us to show the way to the rest of the community and societies what's needed for a better country and a better community and a better society. So we will continue to campaign against any political party that stands in our way or disagrees with our values. My union, we represent workers in the industries of the metalworkers, i.e. construction metalworkers, maintenance in metalworkers, and also manufacturing metalworkers. We also represent workers in the print and packaging industry. We represent workers in the food industry. We represent workers in the vehicle industry, and we also have our technical and supervisory industry also within our union. Just to give you a bit of a flavour of what our union's about, they're the industries we support. We have a youth committee, we have a women's committee, we have a retired members division committee that fights hard and does really do what it's supposed to do when we're talking about fair go for pensioners and the passion that comes out of the RMD. We also believe in social justice, and not just in the workplace but outside the workplace. That is a bit of a flavour of what this branch is becoming, where we want to go, and that's our vision. I welcome everybody to the AMW today. It is somewhat a bit of a shame that some of us couldn't be here and have it a bit bigger, but I'm glad it's happening because it needs to start at places like this. And when I was approached about having the conference here, there was no second thoughts. It was all about, yes, it's absolutely available to groups like yourselves who have and share the same values as us. So welcome to the AMW, and support that we may be given in the future is only a step away. It's only a question. And I look forward to what comes out of this conference, because I've become a state secretary that before you actually judge people, you should be curious about what people are doing, why they are the way they are, and be curious before judge people. So the curiosity for me out of this conference would be ideas, vision, and what will it take to achieve those goals that this conference will aim for. So welcome. And I wish you all the best. Okay, people have mentioned that, we just had a federal election. Yes, we did, and we are very, very proud to see the arse and the back of Scott Morrison. That was the good outcome from this election. People stood up, they were sick of the lies, they were sick of the mistrust. They had the opportunity, and they failed us as Australians, they failed us as a government. And people did speak and stand up in the election. It was an interesting outcome of the election, as Brother Joe said, and people were analysing why people voted the way they did. But it was pretty clear to me that people were voting for a cleaner world, a cleaner energy. And the other thing I take out of the election was equal rights, including women. Was something that I really took out of this election when I was out there electioneering. And what we were electioneering for, and we planned on this since October last year. This branch has been out electioneering for the last 6 months. I said October last year, it's probably more than that. And we started off early because we didn't know when the election was going to be called. But we had a vision. We set out a project, and What we've seen out of COVID-19 was really the working class that suffered from it. We had closures, we had people asked to work shorter hours, people were working less, and when we done that analysis around that, it really was telling us that working class was suffering because majority of them were relying on overseas supplies. And it brought light to something. What we've been arguing for the last 30, 40, 50 years. Manufacture it here, make it here, become a sovereign country. We don't have to rely on others. We've got the intelligence, we've got the supplies, we've got what it needs to take to make it here. So why have they taken it overseas? When I heard that, and it should be a swear word to say Scott Morrison, but when I heard him say he's going to support manufacturing in this country, it was a lie. Because he and his government are the ones that got rid of making vehicles here. Closed down the car industries where we lost over, I would say, 200,000 jobs. They shut down our Williamstown dockyards. We're not building frigates anymore. They recently shut down the Altona refinery for whatever reason. And we're seeing what happened with petrol prices there. That government was just full of lies and people seen right through it, and we had to expose it. And the manufacturing campaign was about exposing the lies, exposing the truths. And why do we want manufacturing and make it here so important? Because it talks about, and what it will do, it will improve everything that we've been talking about. Social justice, it'll improve, create decent, secure jobs. It'll create opportunity for migration. There's no point having migration if they don't have jobs. They've got to have good jobs. It'll bring back the trades. It'll bring back the apprenticeships. It'll bring back the training that we need for the future generation. And all those reasons that when we were planning around the manufacturing campaign, it exposed it all. And people were listening. When we wore our tops manufacturing here and make it here, we were getting people engaged. Not just the people that are in the union, but your general community out there saying, that's what we need back in this country. Because we've seen it in the past, and we knew what it was like in the past, and we see it where it is present. And the present wasn't good, and we need to reverse that. And that's the way forward for our union, and our goal is to bring it all back. One important thing and one important example that we're talking about is the clean energy of the future. Investing some money into that and making sure that, you know, those things that we invest in the clean energy are made here. We had a major campaign out of the seat at Wannon, and people said, Mav, you're crazy, you will never win the seat at Wannon. But that's okay, we'll shake the cage. And why we picked Wannon is because in the area of Wannon we have a company called Kentwell Prince that employs our members, and that company makes wind towers. That's their forte, wind towers. And when you look at the projected plan in wind towers and how many wind towers are made in this country, it'll be less than 1%. And when people are talking about transitioning from dirty energy to clean energy, well, we've got to transition. Enough of the talk, we need to act upon it. The government of now needs to invest in the future. And if that means making our wind towers here, that's exactly what it should mean. And create those good jobs, those secure jobs and the jobs of the future. That's what we need this government to do. We need this government to fix the industrial relations laws and go better to improve and support working class of this country. We have seen it for too long. How hard it is to negotiate an agreement, how long-winded it is, and never remind ourselves of major disputes of the past. The CUB dispute, 6 months dispute, the SA dispute, 2 years dispute, major disputes. And why did those disputes happen? It's because legislation allowed it to happen. And we've got to stop that, we've got to prevent that, and bring back the pendulum back to the working class people. And we need the Industrial Relations Act to be improved. Probably rewritten, to be quite honest. It needs to be rewritten and written proper. And go back the way it was once upon a time. Having the ability to right to strike. Why can't we have the ability to right to strike? That's the question. We should have the right to strike. because at the end of the day, that's the negotiating chip. That is our biggest bargaining power, our labour. And if we have not got the right to remove our labour, well, then we've become what people are saying, modern slavery. And we need that right, we need that power. And be responsible around it. What is involved in it? What investment needs in industry, etc., etc. There's a lot to do, and there's opportunity now. We've got pledges of candidates, not just candidates, but elected candidates now, that have signed our pledges to improve relations, industrial relations. They've signed our pledges to support Australian manufacturing in our manufacturing campaign. And there's a lot of work to be done. And it won't happen overnight, but we cannot take off our focus. We cannot let it wait for too long and hear from politicians, oh, let's just wait till the next term. No, we want it now. We want it as soon as we can. And we understand the processes through parliamentary and all those processes that are going to take place. That's fine. But there's certain things they can do immediately, i.e. the ABCC. And what has that done in the construction industry and attacking unions all the time? When unions are fighting for an example of having women's toilets on a site where a union gets fined for fighting for that. That's your kind of ABCC that we see. Since the ABCC's been around, deaths and injuries in the construction industry have increased dramatically. And then we've got, code compliance out of the ABCC and the building code. Eliminate it. You can get rid of it immediately. Get rid of it. Let's get on with the game. Let's get on with the focus. We don't have to wait too long for that. Let's bring it all back. Let's give the power back to the worker and bring the balance back where we can be responsible and collaborate with industry and make it all work and listen to each other and be curious about people's concerns and what we need to do in this country. So there's some of the things that we're focused on coming out of the election, and we're proud of the election. This branch worked hard and we want our merits back. We want the compliments returned about what needs to be done for working class people. That's what we expect and that's what we want. The future has a lot more to deal with. They're just some of the things I have time to talk about. But we've also got, while we're dealing with that, we've also got a state election coming up in November. And even though I believe, that this current government is a progressive government in the state. We are making trains here, trams and electric buses. We are manufacturing our clean energy projects here through Keppel Prince. That's who makes those wind towers for the state government when we're talking about local projects. But when it's a federal project or a private project, it gets made overseas and those opportunities are lost. So we support those things that this state government is doing. Is introduced industrial manslaughter. We've been waiting for that since 1970 when the Westgate Bridge collapsed. We got it. It's an improvement. It's progressive. We've got wage theft laws now in the state, which is progressive, but we need to do more. It can't stop there. There's more to be done. Leading up to the state election, we will have our demands, our union, and we will make some demands. Whether they're accepted or not, we should never take our vision away when things and opportunities come our way. Because we want more support on social housing. We want more support on people that are on drug and alcohol and gambling addiction. There's mental health issues out there that need more support also. And that doesn't just help the working class, that helps everybody. And nobody should be forgotten when it comes to those matters. We want to improve the H&S Act. Too many people have died. Well, I went to the Workers' Memorial Day this year. 66 or 62 people died in Victoria last year. 62 people too many. And then when you've got to listen to the grievance and the issues that follow that, it's terrible, it's amazing. And what support is given to those families and the widows and the people that are left behind from that. We all know it, we all say it. Nobody should go to work, get injured and die at work. We should all return home with all our limbs and all our fingers and live a decent life. Not a life that we struggle, a life that we have a decent life And that's why manufacturing is so important, and we will not change our vision on that or our ideas. We're our union. We're organised, we educate, and then we agitate. That's what we do, and that's our vision. Whether the social justice movements or whether it's in industrial relations, we will agitate. And agitate for the working class. That's who we represent in our members. And I might just leave it at that, because I can just go on and on and on, let me tell you. I'll need 4 hours to cover it all, and probably still not have it. So I'm happy to take any questions anybody's got to ask, and thank you for the opportunity. And I've got to say, welcome to the AMWU, and never forget, we'll always respect the traditional owners of this land. Thank you.
Now, if anybody on Zoom or from the floor would like to ask Tony Mav any questions in relation to what he's talked about, he obviously covered a lot of room, a lot of topics and a lot of issues that workers are facing in Australia. And the fantastic thing he mentioned, of course, was the fact that united, we need to struggle to ensure that all of the demands that are put on, that the unions are insisting upon, that we all get behind those demands and unite and push those demands forward. So does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask Tony before he leaves today?
Which includes people on Zoom.
Excellent. So we have one question from the floor. Yep.
Yes, I'd like to ask you about mandates. All these mandates that is happening, and they say that the government is going to lift it.
Yeah.
And they say that they have lifted it. But the government might have lifted it because the election's around the corner, but the organisations, the corporates, they still have those mandates in place. So why have the corporates got the mandates in place when the government said that no more mandates? And election coming up, they'll be saying it a lot more. So could you clarify, please?
Yes, good question, Nita. Very important one, and it's something we tackled today. This branch, when mandates came out, it's on our media sites, it's on our Facebook. We oppose mandates. We think that wasn't the way forward. We had the biggest challenge where the first employer came out was the SPC, and he put the pressure on those workers saying, you must be vaccinated before you come to work, right? Most workers, let me tell you, understand it, especially in the food industry. We have workers in the food industry, they have a vaccination program. But workers don't like to be told what to do. They want to be educated. So what we did out at SPC, we actually pushed back on the employer and said, how dare you force people to do something which you got no right? And we put the matter in dispute, there's no consultation, etc, etc. But what we did do is then put in an education program for our members out there. And I believe 99% of our members at the end of the day ended up getting vaccination, right? COVID to us was, it was very challenging times. We've never seen it before. I've definitely never seen it before, and it was challenging. But the first thing we do as a union, we call it a H&S issue. And the first thing we did as a union is that we put in procedures and policies, not so much policies, but procedures preventing COVID or viruses coming onto our site. And we done it very early before mandates were involved. We set it out to all our health and safety reps, said put these procedures in place to prevent. That's what we do, prevent, before worrying about something going wrong. And that worked really well, and that's why you would find, that's why most of our industries stayed open. We work collaborative with companies, most of them, not all. SPC is not a friendly union company, let me tell you, right? But we work collaborative with most companies. They invested into their work plans, making sure they had social distancing. We introduced masks and heat temperature things and all those other things that we can prevent it from coming on site. And it worked really well. And when we had to argue or lobby government about our industries, it was evident that our industries had put in good methods, and therefore our industries never shut down. Mandates we don't support, we never will. And yes, now we've seen, I think it's slowed down a little bit, Anita, we've seen employers take advantage and introducing their own policies about mandating vaccinations. Today it'll be COVID, next week it'll be flu, next week it'll be something else. And it is something that, you know, the union will stand by its workers and its members, because if they're going to do something like that, there needs to be proper consultation first. And we will run the OH&S through it, because it'll be a OH&S issue, and we need proper consultation about why and how, and the education program that will come through that. And is it reasonable for a company to introduce a mandate about something that somebody may oppose? Right, so there's a lot of work to be done on that. I mean, it has quieted down a lot. We are still asking governments to remove the mandate. But at the same time, I don't think we should all get complacent, right? Because it's important. COVID's still out there. We still got plenty of numbers of COVID sickness, right? And we should not get complacent. We should always be aware and concerned and just act responsibly, right? Getting back to basics. Wash your hands, right? Back to the basics. If you feel uncomfortable, I normally carry a mask with me every time. If I feel uncomfortable, I'll put on a mask. And when it came down to the vaccination, our branch, we did have a think about and talk about what the vaccination meant and where were we going to stand on it. And I think the best thing we did with our union, we virtually told our members, if you're not sure about the vaccination, do what we do. Go to your doctor. Ask your doctor. I'm 54 years old. For 54 years I've been going to my doctor when I'm sick or when I'm concerned. I get guidance by my doctor, and I'm still standing here after 54 years, God bless, right? I never check what's in the medication and all that sort of stuff. I normally trust my doctor, I take it and I'm fine. And that's the direction we were asking our members to do. If you have concerns about the vaccination, if you have concerns about your health, go to your doctor, your friendly local doctor, and ask him about it. And there are still workers that in a difficult predicament, and they are good people. They've been good, loyal unionists and good workers, but for reasons that they have, personal reasons, they didn't want to get vaccinated. And we didn't judge those people. We supported those people, and it was difficult times. So we are still out there fighting against, you know, employees that may take advantage of mandating whatever they may want to mandate, and that's challenging times, and we will fight for workers, and I hope other unions do too.
Thank you, Tony.
Yeah,
Sorry, it's a long
I've got, if you just, I'm just speaking to people who on the Zoom. I think most of you turn, if you want to say something, you get a chance. Hopefully the sound system works, and you'll get a chance to say your piece. Now, Chip, you had a question on chat. Would you like to ask it? And we'll see if it works.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Just.
It might be, yeah, this is not connected to the system, so I'll have to convey it.
Joe, I've written the question out, just read it out.
Yep, that might be better. So it's just other people can't hear you. I can hear you clearly, but they can't. Okay, the question for you, Mav. What is our strategy to win back the right to strike? What actions will be required, and by who, to achieve this?
I mean, like I was saying before, we have opportunity now. This pledge has been signed about, you know, removing, replacing, improving the Industrial Relations Act. We have to lobby and campaign and watch this space and make sure when that happens, it's done properly. It's written out the way for working class. But let's not stop there, right? No matter whether the legislation is improved, and I believe it will be, we just can't stop there, right? We've got to convince people and support people as a collective to take strike. Because what we have learned, what I've learned in 22 years as an official of this union, is that you really achieve your goals when you take action. So we've been taking action even during difficult times with bad legislation, right? It can't be just the legislation gets improved. We've got to influence people and give people confidence when the employer is not negotiating in good faith and making squillions of dollars and is only offering peanuts, we've got to give workers confidence that the collective has got your back and be able to, you know, do what we've done in the past. That's my view of it. It just doesn't stop with legislation. Legislation is not just the answer. It's part of the answer. It's confidence, it's collective movement is the answer to me. And we're going to be able to get out there and support people that are willing to have a go where their employer is not bargaining in the way he should bargain. Yes, I can answer.
Actually, I'll just say one thing. I mean, I know we had a discussion the other day here with the branch meeting after, because I think one of the things we can agree on with outside of Parliament and all that, that's where the real action's going to be, where we move forward. And I think you've touched on that a bit further. But I think the key is to reach out to the broader community as well to take action in one way or the other. Because as I said, we've got to put that pressure back on the governments, regardless of who's in power. That this is how the change is going to happen.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, the concerning part to me, I guess, is that, you know, we've got to do it collectively, right? Every union will have their ask, I guess. Community groups will have their asks, and it all needs to come together and act as a collective movement. And it's about, you know, maybe I don't like using this word, but as I say, secretary, I've learnt that discipline is important, is that it's done in a progressive way and it's done in a collective way. If we've got all sorts of groups just doing their own individual thing, it'll cloud the issue, and that is concerning, all right? We don't want to cloud the issue, we want to stay focused. We don't want the ability for others to say, well, we've done that and we've done that and we've done that. It needs to be a collective approach with all those issues on the table, and look after each and every one of us, right? Because every community group and every union, like I said, will have their concerns. I think the union movement will have a collective concern. I think with the Industrial Relations Act, number one, and social justice will be there from our union. But we've got to be disciplined, and we've got to act as a collectively to make sure we're achieving, right? If we splinter, they'll take advantage of it. If we stay collective, they can't. Right.
Excellent. Does anybody from Zoom have any questions they'd like to ask Tony, or any comments? If not, we'll move on to our third speaker. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you for listening, guys, and enjoy your conference.
Thank you. And I do apologise, actually, Tony, for not appreciating the fact that the AMWU had given us the use of the rooms. So my apologies, and we thank you profoundly for the use of the rooms. It's not easy to get rooms these days. It costs a lot of money to rent rooms. So for us to be able to use these facilities is fantastic.
Enjoy the facility.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
See you, mate.
Thanks, Cal.
Thank you, brother.
Thanks for the question.
I think some of the key areas that Tony and Joe have touched on is this whole idea of collective unity and a collective movement, and that's what we're here today to do. We're trying to define what that collective movement is and try to find these points of unity that we can take forward, and recognizing that the answers aren't going to be necessarily, well, they historically we know that the answers aren't in our parliaments as the way they are set up today. But we'll continue that discussion during the discussion period. But for now, I'd like to introduce Ian Watson. As I mentioned before, he's an economist and has done a lot of work on wages and research in the field of economics. So without anything further, Ian.
Thanks for the invitation to speak. I'm not sure how many of you have the fortune to get through those election debates, the leaders' debates, but you may recall that moment when Anthony Albanese gave a commitment that I was paid workers would not fall behind with their real wages. He was very fond of bashing that old coin. And of course, when Morrison came to answer, he bubbled about and didn't really have an answer for it, just saying how complicated it really was. Couldn't have low-paid workers getting real wage increases. And I'll have returned it, it's only gone up by 2%.
Yeah. Could you hang on? Can you hang on a moment, Ian? Your volume's gone down. So we need to.
Turn it up.
Yeah, we're just trying to figure out how to turn it up here. This is,
I'll turn it up.
if you can, that would certainly help.
That's fine.
Yep, that's fine. It should be fine.
Okay, and by the way, I'll need you to allow me to share the screen, if that's okay.
I will work that out.
Right, you might have to go into the preferences settings.
Yeah, I'll let you do it, so thanks.
Anyway, I don't know how much you heard, but essentially I was saying that when it comes to wages for low-paid workers, Morrison did not think it was acceptable that they kept up with the cost of living. And this was at a time when company profits had gone up by 25%. So part of what I'm going to talk about now is the background to wages in Australia, why we have the situation we have now, and also working time, which is another major issue. And Tony's comments were quite illuminating, because it took me back to the 1980s and the last time Australia faced thinking about the future that we might have. And those of you old enough to remember might think about the Australia Reconstructed initiative, where the thought was that Australia might get into high-tech manufacturing. It might follow the pathway of those Scandinavian social democracies and end up having a highly productive economy, still open to the world, still a trading nation, but not just a quarry and a milk bar, as the Australian economy has sometimes been described. And that wasn't taken up, that initiative. Instead, we got enterprise bargaining. And I was around in the early 90s, in fact I was working in industrial relations, when all the early enterprise bargaining agreements were being fashioned. And what we noticed was that there wasn't an onslaught on wages. The employers didn't try to knock off wages. In fact, they were offering reasonable wage increases. This is the early 90s I'm talking about. But what they wanted were trade-offs. And the trade-offs they kept asking for were things like demarcation disputes, ending those, so that the same worker could do a whole lot of work, getting rid of the ratio between apprentices and tradespeople, and we have seen that where that's ended up with a major schools crisis across the country. Basically, the employers didn't want to keep those ratios and keep their apprentices in-house. The other thing that they really...
What have you done?
Nothing, it's...
Give me nothing.
I've been doing it, no, it's confusing. It'll come back on again.
In the middle of the
In the
screen.
middle of the screen.
Yep,
Yep.
no,
Click.
just
At the
getting
same
that.
time, labour productivity has gone up by more than 20%. So basically, the ability of employers to extract more productivity from the workforce
That's what
and not
happened
to
yesterday.
reward it
Transferred
with
from
wage
the-
increases
Yeah.
has been out of control. That's the
Yeah,
gap
that's
we've
what
been
happened.
seeing now over this 30-year period. Certainly there are periods where productivity has dropped, like it did in the early 2000s, and then recently employers complain about it flatlining. But look what's happening with wages at the same time. The wages share of national income has plummeted during these periods. So even though productivity has been low at times, and that's usually because of employer reluctance to invest in capital. They basically want to extract the profits, return them as dividends to their shareholders, and not reinvest them in the business they're operating. But you can see that the whole notion that workers have to work harder to justify wage increase is totally unjustified. Now, a couple of other insights into wages I'll show you. This one here shows you basically what's happened with the low paid, the average and the high paid workers since the early 80s. And basically the yellow orange line is the lowest paid worker and the red line are the higher paid workers. All of them saw cuts in real wages during the Accord period of the late 80s and into the 90s during the recession period and through to when Howard came to power. And in the case of the higher paid workers, they got back to their starting point towards the end of the 1990s. But if you look here at the lowest paid workers, it wasn't until about 2003 that they caught up with where they'd been back in the 1980s. That was the same for women. It wasn't until after the GFC in the 2010s they crept ahead in real terms by 10%. And this is even shown if we break it out slightly differently. Look at it this way. The orange line again is the lowest paid, and you can see how for the best part of 40 years it's flat-lined. And those in what we call the second quintile, the second fifth of the income earnings, they did a little bit better. You move up to the middle, and these are all real earnings by the way, they do a bit better as well, but it's only when you get to the fourth and the top quintile, that is your high paid workers. We're talking workers here, we're not talking executives, we're not talking self-employed or business people. Their graphs would be off the charts. You wouldn't see the growth they've had. These are just ordinary workers, but it's only been the high paid workers that have done got anywhere ahead since the 2000s. And for women, of course, it's been worse. They haven't had anywhere near that share. So basically, this has been a history of 40 years of wage suppression while productivity has still been growing. Now, the question for you is, why has this happened? What's behind this? Now, I mentioned before the working time arrangements. There's also been not only the ability to buy labour in small chunks and in that way to minimise the outlay, not to have to pay full-time permanent work, but to just buy work as you need it. There's also been opening the economy to international competition. That's taken place in two ways. It's taken place through offshoring. You know, workers went through the Accord period, put up with all the early period of enterprise bargaining, trading away their conditions. They were told that they were going to make their workplaces more competitive and able to compete. And then what did employers do? They outsourced to China and other low-wage countries. So in other words, they didn't keep up their end of the bargain. And so in that way, international competition for the best part of 10 years saw unemployment fail to recover. So in the 90s, we started to get the economy reviving, but we got what's called jobless growth. In other words, it didn't manifest in new jobs for workers, and that was because the jobs were being offshored. The other thing that's happened has been bringing in labour. We have a history in this country, unlike Europe, of not having guest workers. Workers that came and built the hydro and built manufacturing industry in the 40s and 50s, they were all permanent migrants. Now certainly they faced racism and they faced an obligation to settle in country towns for 2 years before they could return to the city. So it wasn't all red and roses, but nevertheless they became part of the Australian community and their kids went on to university and became the doctors and lawyers and accountants of today. What did we get after 2000? We got temporary migration. Now this next chart shows you what's called net overseas migration. So this is the increase in people coming into Australia, taking account of those who have left. And these are just two of the groups, which are visas with working rights. You've probably all heard of 457 visas, or working holidays where you can have a holiday here and work, and students who are allowed to work. And those figures up the left-hand side there are in the thousands. So we're basically seeing around about 2013 up to 200,000 visas being issued. This is each year of workers who could, temporary workers who could work here. And at the peak with the students in about 2009, 150,000, and then as recently as 2019, another 150,000. Now this is on an annual basis, but some calculations have been done that at any one time there's over 800,000 workers, temporary workers from overseas in Australia able to work here. And we all know the horror of some of those stories. The workers in the 7-Eleven petrol stations, the students who can't work more than 20 hours officially, they work more, then the employer has a stranglehold over them and threatens to report them. So what do we get? We get wage theft. Agriculture, an absolute scandal. Not just the schemes from the Pacific Island and the backpackers, but any opportunity that those labour hire companies that supply agriculture will exploit that workforce. Whether it's putting a dozen people in a 3-bedroom home and charging them $200 a week rent and then barely paying them an hourly rate that's above $5 or $10 an hour. They're the kind of abuses that this pattern of immigration of temporary workers has seen us inflicted on us. Now you notice the massive drop after COVID, and that's now why employers are screaming that we've got to open up the borders and get workers back in. Skilled workers are in short supply, we've got labour shortages. They want to get back to this situation where they can keep a lid on wages and they've got access to labour, not just in-time labour, which they get through insecure work, but overseas labour that can be turned on and turned off just like a tap. That's the situation which overseas migration now sees not only Australia exposed to international competition by outsourcing and going overseas, but international competition by bringing the workers into Australia. Now, one of the reasons that migration is favoured, and this next graph is a bit complicated, but I'll try and explain it to you. The reason economists like to see immigration at high levels is it helps economic growth. More and more people to buy products in the shops, more and more services to sell, more people to make up demand, basically, consumer demand. Now, this is showing us what's called net national disposable income. It's all of the income produced by a country taken back to what it would mean per head of population. In other words, each person's share of that. And this is the growth in it. And the red line is how it's trended over time. Because it bounces around a lot. Every year it goes up and down because immigration goes up and down and production of goods and services goes up and down. But what it basically tells us that from 1975 through to about 2000, it was steadily going up. So even though there was immigration during that period, the economy was growing stronger than immigration was growing. So everyone was sharing in some of that income. Our net disposable income was going up. Since 2000, it's been going down. Now, that's not saying that GDP, economic growth, hasn't occurred, but what it's saying is that economic growth has been driven by immigration alone. The economy is not productive enough to keep that net disposable income going up. So our living standards overall per person has been falling. So not just wages for ordinary everyday Australians being suppressed, as I've been explaining, but the average amount of the general output of the economy that goes to each person, in theory, is not there anymore without immigration. And employers know this, business knows this, government probably knows this, and that's why you'll see an attempt to ramp up immigration. Now, it's also been said that trade union membership has collapsed. So we've had reference already from Tony to the right to strike having been removed. And some people will say the fall in union density, because back in the 70s, between 40 and 60%, around 50% of people were in unions, much higher for males than females. And that's steadily fallen down now to where it's basically in the mid-teens. Now, I'll draw your attention to a couple of interesting points. It crossed over in the early 2000s, where women are now the largest component of the labour force that's in trade unions. So the stereotype of a blue-collar trade union member has got to be updated. It's basically women, a lot of them in service industries, in the big public sector unions, the teachers, the nurses and so forth. But here's a fairly sobering thought. Amongst young people aged 15 to 19, only 5% of them are in unions, and those who are aged 20 to 24, in other words young adults, it's about 6%. So if we think about the ageing of the workforce and the ageing of our trade union members, it is pretty grim to think that those coming on now are just not part of the union. Now, I should add though, union density isn't everything. The presence of unions in workplaces, their ability to sustain the award system, their ability to bargain in enterprise agreements means they're considerably overrepresented in the kind of political and industrial clout compared to what membership density shows. So as institutions in our economy, they're far more important than these figures show. So while these figures are a cause for concern and a real wake-up call as far as our younger members are concerned, we mustn't lose sight of the fundamental strength that unions still have in an institutional way. And you can see that in the ability of the demolition of work choices during 2007. It was the trade unions really that threw Howard out. And more recently, the rebuttal of the Joe Hockey budget in 2014 that was going to privatise Medicare and strip away Social Security. It was community resistance based on the notion of fairness that stopped that. And fairness is a fundamental ethical principle of trade unionism, and that's where that's come from. So these figures are concerning, but you mustn't lose sight of the fact that trade unions have been fundamental historically and institutionally in what we need to build upon. Now, here's my final slide, and again it's a complicated one, so you'll need to bear with me while I explain it. The blue is basically the growth in GDP. That's our output, the country's output. Every time it drops below the dotted line, there's a recession basically. 1991, the GFC, and more recently the COVID one. And every time it peaks, that's a bit of a boom period. So it jumps up and down a lot. Now the interesting bit here is the gold. Some people would say that interest rates drive the economy. You know, when they're falling, as the Reserve Bank brings it right down to nearly zero recently, that's meant to kickstart the economy, a bit like a jump starter in a car. It doesn't work though. As everyone says, you can't push on a piece of string. Jack up your interest rates and you'll certainly send the economy into a nose spin. And we saw that with Keating in the early 90s, 17% interest rates and the worst recession since the 1930s. However, what's often overlooked and more important in many ways is this gold line. And that's actually credit. That's the banks lending money. When they lend far more money than can be used by the economy to generate goods and services, it goes into asset bubbles. So in the late 80s, we had the first big asset bubble, that stock market and house prices going through the roof. Then in the lead up to the GFC, same thing, another asset bubble. And basically every asset bubble ends sadly. When this yellow line begins to drop, it sends the economy into a tailspin. So we also get a recession, not just from high interest rates, but from turning off the taps. Businesses that would like to keep investing can't get access to credit. Homeowners can't do anything in terms of trying to build more homes. So basically, here we are now, again, heading towards an asset bubble with housing. And of course, the COVID line here is the blue one. It's a bit unrepresentative because it was such an extreme period. But my warning to you would be, don't just look at interest rates, look at what APRA is doing, turning on and turning off the tap for credit. Or look at government schemes to boost credit. They're the things that will end up either driving us into a recession or giving us a more stable period of economic growth. So I might end at that point, and I'm happy to take any questions, or I can wait till later if you prefer.
Take questions from Joe.
Yeah, we can take questions on anything, on any of them.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Very informative.
You're muted.
Joe, we're on mute. We're good? Can you hear?
Unmute us.
Oh, yes.
Lovely. All right, thank you very much, Ian. Very informative and lots of information there into as to how the economy functions, and more importantly, into the kind of period that we're heading into as a result of a bit of a credit bubble occurring. So we'll take questions from anybody for both Ian and Joe, and then maybe we can begin a discussion about how we see the way forward and how we can build unity around some key and what will be the key things that we can build unity around. So does anybody in Zoom or from the floor have any questions they'd like to ask Joe or contribute to the discussion?
Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to talk about was the thing about the future and also the past, because one thing that's not talked about ever is how old Labour used to make it its priority to, as they said back in the day, take on the money power, finance. And this is something that it doesn't seem like any of the Labour movement has, or at least from my knowledge, has put as a priority. So particularly it's the issue of the banking sector and having a national bank as opposed to these private corporate banks, because the Commonwealth Bank it just operates like NAB or ANZ, when we should have, I think like China, other countries that have socialized their credit should be not in the hands of the bankers, but in fundamentally serving the Commonwealth. So I think this is something that is not talked about, but maybe if you put to the front of the agenda in the future, because I feel like Labour used to be able to prioritise this, and since Whitlam, it's fallen off entirely, and we're seeing ourselves dominated by this sort of financial oligarchy, and this impacts all of us. You know, whether you're in a union or not, like being dominated by financial oligarchy is not preferable, and we should have a Commonwealth Bank that serves the public interest, not the private interest. So that's where I would say, like, I'd be curious what other people have to say about that, and that's a very kind of common thing that people could rally behind, is a national bank. So that's just what I have to say.
Thank you. Joe's going to reply to that or make a comment?
Yeah, I want to comment, and I think what Nada said is important. If you remember back in history, I mean, even then, governments decided that they do need to have did need to have a major public bank. I mean, the Labor Party once agitated for it. They lost an election over it. But the following government, that was under Robert Menzies, introduced the Commonwealth Bank. The Commonwealth Bank was found necessary in order to do two things. One is there were complaints about how the other banks were treating the small depositors. But there was also a need for government to raise finance. And both of those, at least in part, were met by the creation of the Commonwealth Bank. That was sold off. Now the Commonwealth Bank is a private bank acting like all the others. So there is a huge problem there. In this time where, as has been said, manufacturing is largely gone, where economic pressures are severe, much more severe than are being led on, that a government that should enter into economic plan, a plan to develop a stronger new economy needs to access finance. It needs to establish the means to do it, and one of the means to control the industry, and I should have stepped in under the Accord years, or during the Accord years, one of the things that did happen is the banks began, or the financial system began to be deregulated, and this needs to be reversed. There needs to be control over finance and investment. The best way to do it is that, and I think yes, at the very minimum, there should be a call for the setting up of an infrastructure bank that will help to build new industries, and we should say new industries that are clean, that are sustainable given the climate situation. But we also need industries that help people, that are, again, the idea of turning the economy for people. I think a national savings bank would be a good thing as well. We all know a few years ago there was an outcry over the treatment of people by the banks. There was a lot of criminal activity. No one seems to have suffered consequences for their behaviour, people who are responsible in the banks. There was an inquiry, a Royal Commission I should say. As soon as the results, which were pretty damning, came out, the whole thing was swept under the carpet. So we need to change that. If we don't establish control over the financial system operating in this country, there's not much else we can do.
Would anybody from the Zoom, does anybody have any questions?
Yes, there is a question here from for Ian. From your wages growth figures, early slides, would there be a case for the unions campaigning on the basis of a flat rate rise to favour the lower income earners?
It sounds good in theory, but there are some problems with that. The Accord period was notable for the fact that flat wage increases were part of that arrangement. And what it saw was a shrinking in relativities. Now, I'm not going to defend the high wage earners, because we saw in those graphs how much they benefited in terms of the takeoff from the mid-90s onwards. But in the lower half of the wages distribution, there's a lot of differentiation between different skill levels. And the concept of margins for skill, which was a fundamental part of the arbitration system for decades, meant there was always an incentive for workers to improve their skills, to take on trades, to basically seek a career path. And you have to be careful not to erode that, because it undermines the morale of those people in those intermediate levels of the wage distribution. If they see workers below them being paid a lot more than seems warranted by the work they're doing. And it goes back to a period of work value when we used to actually assess what was the worth of a job and how much should it be paid. We've lost sight of that to some extent. And the idea of a solidaristic wages policy, which is what it's called in Scandinavia, of a very flat sort of wages system, not a lot of differentiation, is often being pointed to as a very sort of socially integrative kind of way of thinking about earnings. And we shouldn't have a lot of inequality. And I would strongly support that. The problem it raises, and I encountered this myself on a visit to Norway, where I met a young woman who was a vet working in an abattoir, and she'd done 6 years of university training, and she was being paid less than the abattoir workers. Now, you might argue, well, that's fine, they're getting a danger allowance, they're doing awful work, having to slaughter animals, and so that could seem to be okay. But from her point of view, she wondered why she was on such a low wage when she'd studied for so long. So I don't want to sort of comment on the ethics or morality of that situation, because from an animal welfare point of view, you want vets in those places if you're going to have them, and you want the most humane treatment and all of that. The issue, I think, is rather what does it mean for incentives for further training if you have flat rate rises? And to some extent, we've got to come to a position where the whole of the bottom half of the wages distribution is brought up. And it's brought up in such a way that it doesn't jeopardise margins for skill. And we've got to find a way that the top half of the income distribution is reined in. And we've also obviously got to look at executive salaries and all the other ways in which earnings dispersion has got out of control over the last 30 years. And a fair bit of that is outside the reach of unions because those people are not in trade unions and are not part of the bargaining. After all, about a third are on awards, a third are in enterprise agreements, and the remaining third are under contracts, private contracts. So it's a big ask for unions to have to deal with that. That's where the government and basically the taxation system and a whole lot of other measures have to be brought to bear to try and do something about wage inequality.
Excellent, thank you, Ian.
There's a comment here from Vera. Superannuation funds should only be invested in Australia to restore manufacturing and housing.
Which makes sense, and I think that leads actually going back to perhaps the whole real purpose of the meeting. You know, apart from the fact to inform us of what's going on in our economy, is to try to come to some understanding of how we are going to move forward. And so I think at this stage, unless somebody has a pressing comment or a pressing question they'd like to ask, I'd like us to move on to discussing the issue of how can we form some unity. What are the questions that we're going to form some kind of unity over? And I think that's important because we know that the governments of the day, we know that historically the governments of the day don't live up to our expectations, and so we need to have a plan B. We know that Labor has said some really good things. We know that Labor traditionally gives the working class more room for manoeuvring in the economy and so on, but in the end we also know that they don't quite reach the standards that we expect from them. So I think at this point, if we could move on and maybe perhaps talk about some kind of some leading points that we would like to form unity on, and really try to build a movement that involves people at the grassroots level. Dave, would you like to say something?
Well, just on that point, I think what happens, people need a vision, something they can work around. We talked about having a publicly owned banks, be it an infrastructure bank and a national savings bank. The financial system has got to be part of that. It's got to be a radical restructuring of the whole economy. Once again, an economy that will serve the public, for the greater good, not for the very few anymore, which is what we currently live under. We've seen what's happened. We've dominated, and quite rightly too, finance is a huge sector we need to take on and that back under our control, because they actually are controlling policy, the whole lot. And every government we've had along has been to protect and uphold those super profits they make. And I think it's time now. We need to have an economy that serves the people and not for the very few. And I think if we've got that vision in place, that includes a large manufacturing area as well, because you can't have a strong domestic economy without a strong manufacturing base. The two actually go hand in hand. And I saw those graphs like from the 70s onwards. Yeah, I've got that. We've been living on credit. I'm surprised we've even got this far, but you can just see it's been a continual spiral down and down and down, and especially too for younger people as well. Pardon to use the term, but I mean I believe the younger generation, they've all been handed a big shit stick, sticky end first. And I can understand why they're angry as well about a lot of things, because they didn't have the opportunities like our parents and that did. They were able to join the old saying, you join the firm, you join for life, and all that security they had around. So, and trying to buy a home, well, they've had to kiss goodbye to that as well. So that's, I think we've got to have that vision to unite around again, so we can steer our own course again and have our own agenda.
Can I just please, before we continue this discussion, I would just really like to thank Ian Watson for coming along today and his contribution to the discussion. Joe, I'd like to thank you for your contribution to the discussion. And so if anybody needs to leave, I wanted to say that before people left. I just wanted to thank Ian and Joe for their contribution, as we did Mav as well. So yeah, Nada, did you want to say something?
Can I first of all mention there's a couple of comments being put here that people can set up on the screen. Those workers doing heavy lifting cannot work into their 60s and 70s. This is from Steve, well in Sydney. I know, we all know that they're pushing up and continue to push up the retirement age. Therefore, the pay must be higher. Again, I wouldn't see anybody disagreeing with us here. From Elaine, I agree, Steve, not only because they deserve to enjoy their retirement, but while they are still working, they are blocking entry of young people at the bottom of the ladder. Everyone is blocked from advancement. There we are. So we've got that yet.
So,
Continue.
Nada, would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, so one of the things that, just looking at historical trends,
Louder.
sorry, just looking at historical trends, after the unions were, and political parties like the Labour Party and the Communist Party were key during the Great Depression to push for effectively what we know as the Australian dream, where people can own a home. And home ownership is something that is also like really important to highlight here as well, because as you mentioned, it's obviously more out of grasp first home ownership, but even once you've bought a home, you're in debt to the banks forever. For a lot of people, like my father, for example, he's an immigrant. He came in the 80s from Iran, and he worked his ass off, working as a taxi driver, as a petrol station clerk, did all of the stuff that is very typical for a Middle Eastern immigrant, and yet he eventually got to the point where he could afford to take out a mortgage on a house. He still has not paid off that house. He got a good job at one point, and then it got outsourced. And so now he has to go back to working multiple jobs, and he's 60, and he's nowhere near paying off the debt. And most likely, I'm not going to inherit a house, I'm going to inherit debt. And this is the case for like millions of working families across this country, is that we're rattled with debt, and no one talks about the debt issue. Because this is one about the issue of the banks and stuff, because if we are all debt slaves, then we're not free. So I think the problem with the labour movement is just talks about wages. We don't talk about the banks. We don't talk about housing. Because this is all political, and it's not something that can be solved on a shop floor or in a particular industry. This is a national problem, and this is why I think that we have to look in terms of how to address this bigger problem, because no one has any solution. No one wants to challenge the rule of monopoly finance anymore. No one has the political courage to do it, and it's impacting everyone. Whether you're stuck being a rentier or you're stuck being a debt slave to the banks, and I think this is what will unite millions of Australians, who aren't in unions. Because remember, the graph showed it. You got to face the reality that people aren't in unions anymore. The vast majority of Australians aren't in unions anymore. Yet we're still millions and millions of workers who are just trying to get by. So any kind of mass movement in the 21st century has to take into account that it's not going to be a union movement. It's going to be a national political movement around these issues of debt and finance and land reform. So I think that's kind of where I come at it from, because I'm also part of that 5%. I'm 24 myself, so I think that when anyone wants to talk about this, we have to think about it in terms of this national question of financial sovereignty, because literally everything is tied up with it. So that's what I would push to the fore, is like, we should prioritize as a point of unity because this unites everyone. So that's what I'd say.
And that's movement.
Yeah.
And that's movement. Because the politicians really look after the up there, the corporates, the banks. They are in it together.
So
and we just can't move with it. So if we have people power, the masses, and we can protest against it.
All right, so excellent. Can we just, we'll continue with the format because we do actually have two groups of people that can break up into two different groups. We'll take people here in the Zoom, in the actual physical meeting, we'll break up into a group to discuss some key areas that we can unite on, and Joe will facilitate the Zoom group to discuss those key issues of unity. So if we'll take our discussion down the back of the room, please, us in the physical presence, and the Zoom meeting can hold the front of the room.
Okay.
Cool.